So I'm wanting this material 2 3/4 of an inch wide. I'm gonna start by ripping off one of these rounded edges so I have a flat surface to go against my fence. Okay, so now that we have our legs cut, I'm going to cut these down to 37 inches long, bring them back here, lay them back out. I need to figure out exactly what angle that I want my legs because I want a 30-inch span between the legs, extra support. And then I need to figure out the angle of my half laps. So in order to do that, I've lined up the outside edges of this with my table, spaced these out at 30 inches, and I want the top, once the angles are cut, I want those to be at 8 inches. So once everything is laid out the way that I would like it, I'm just going to take my pencil from underneath my table. This is my straight edge. I'm going to make a mark, straight line. I'll tell you what the degrees actually turn out to be, and then I'm just going to mark my tops here. Let's make some cuts. All right, so by using the mark that I placed on the bottom, I'm actually going to use the saw itself to help find this angle. I have some angle finders, all of that fun stuff, but this is a lot quicker. The angle on the ends of our legs ended up being 27 degrees. So I just brought this back over to my workstation, making sure that everything lines up with my straight edge and that I have the width that I want at the top, which is 8 inches. So everything has lined up perfect. Everything is flush at the bottom. We're at 30 inches apart from tip to tip. And then we will cut the 27-degree angle on each of our ends and then move on to our half laps. Okay, so you've seen me set up this depth stop several different times. So this is super simple to do, and you can do it on several different pieces of equipment. So no excuses. So since the material that I'm using is 1.5 inches, I'm going to set my blade to where it will only cut 3/4 of an inch thick. And you do the exact same thing if you were using a circular saw or table saw or whatever. That's all that I've done here is put a 3/4 of an inch mark on the end of a board. I'm going to use that to set my blade. So now that we have our blade depth set for our half laps, let's go ahead and cut this into our legs using the lines that we had drawn on here from earlier. If you're doing this on the miter saw, you'll need a block on the back to ensure that the blade cuts the full thickness of the material. And then you'll set the saw to the angle of your marks, which in this case is 37 degrees. So we'll be cutting this 3/4 of an inch deep and at a 37-degree angle for all 4 half laps on our leg parts. Okay, so I have both of my legs cut out the way that I want them. At least I think it's the way that I want them right now, but they're both half lapped. And just to kind of get you up to speed here on the actual measurements of this half lap, from the tip of the top angle here down to where our half lap begins, we are at 5.5 inches. So once you have your 27-degree cut made, you could just measure down 5.5 inches, or you could lay it out and mark it like I did. So let's move on to the next step. That's going to be cutting the notches to attach these two legs together. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So if I go by my drawings, these legs will actually be spaced out further than this. They're going to be right around 42 inches. So I need something that's going to provide quite a bit of support. Just FYI, I know I'm going to run into some issues along the way, but once we get all those worked out, the final product that we come up with, I'll have plans for that. I actually do everything backwards. So I make my plans after I create the final product and all the kinks are worked out. So if you're watching this, it's already been made. And if you're plans in the hand type of person, head over to the website. So the idea with the notches is to actually cut the notches into the backs of these legs, and then one into the front of these legs, and then inset a 1.5 by 1.5 board into each one of these notches so that it's left flush on all sides. This will provide a ton of support for the longer shelf. So if I want my spacing at 42 inches apart, I need to cut some 1.5 by 1.5 material to that length. I'm going to need 3 of these boards. Once I get those cut, we'll pop these apart and throw some notches in. So since these braces are going to be 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches, which is the exact same dimensions as our arms and shelf brackets, let's go ahead and cut several strips of these. All right, so now that we have our support brackets cut, I'm going to go ahead and mark on my legs where I want these notches. So I've decided that I want my first support bracket 4 inches up from the bottom. This is going to be in the front and the back. So I'll do it on this leg. And then I'll also make this exact 4-inch measurement up on the back of this leg. And I'm going to do this for all 4 of my leg sections. Okay, so we have this 4-inch mark on all 4 of these legs. Say that this side over here is actually going to be the front of the base, and this is going to be the back. I want 2 support boards on the back of this thing. Because we're using a little thinner material for our support, I'm going to be installing 2 boards on each one of the back legs. The bottom of the second board will be placed 12 inches up. And we're only going to be doing this for the 2 back legs. So with those marks in place, and we know that the material that we're going to be using is going to be 1.5 inches wide because It's an 1.5 by 1.5 square. Let's go ahead and measure up from each one of these marks 1.5 inches. So the marks that are in place now will be the bottoms of each one of these notches. Oop. So now that we have our notch placement marked on all of our legs, we have the 2 on each back leg here and the 1 at 4 inches on each one of the front legs. Let's go ahead and pop these things apart. And since our notches are already marked, let's go ahead and cut them out. Now we can cut these out the exact same way that we did for the half laps, but just to show you a different way, I'm going to do it on the table saw. The first thing that I'm going to do is set my blade height to 1.5 inches. Once I get that set, we can start cutting some notches. And doing it this way, you can either cut one notch at a time, or since most of these notches have the exact same measurement, we'll cut several. And again, you can use the miter saw, you can use a table saw, you can use a jigsaw, you can use a circular saw, or you can even use a hand saw. Again, there's no excuses for something as simple as a notch to keep you from trying this project out. So the material cut down to 1.5 by 1.5 stock, we're going to be needing 4 arm supports that are 53.5 inches long each. So if you've used 8-foot material, pick out the straightest part of this board as you can. Of course, anytime that you are ripping wood, if you hit a knot or some tight grain, something like that, it may tend to pop out just a little bit. But make sure that your arm supports are super straight. So 53.5 inches, we need 4 straight boards. Let's go ahead and cut the parts for our arms. And what I'm talking about whenever I say the arm, it's a little mechanism that kind of works like this. It's made up of 2 different boards. I'm thinking that I would like the shelves to at least be 12 inches wide, but not extremely wide like the original shelf. So while we're working this 1.5 by 1.5 material, let's cut enough parts for 10 of these arms. And that'll be 10 pieces that are 12 inches long, and then 10 pieces that are 6 inches long. So with all of our 1.5 by 1.5 parts cut, let's go ahead and get this stuff cleaned up. Again, I just used construction grade lumber here, so looks pretty rough. Since I'm going to be staining this here in a bit, it could definitely use some attention. Okay, so with all of our half laps and our notches cut, now it's time to cut the boards that's going to be connecting these 2 legs. And I'm just going to call these leg supports. So like I said before, our notch depth is 1.5 inches. Let's go ahead and get those cut. You can use the offcuts to make your 3 42-inch leg support boards. All right, so now that we have the leg supports cut, let's see how they fit. I'm going to be installing all of these just kind of loosely. I'm not going to be attaching anything yet, even the legs themselves, because I want to be able to take everything apart here in a bit and actually stain this. It's a lot easier to install these parts if your material is laying flat. Moment of truth here. So let's start with this one. It actually fits. Let's go down to our other side. It should fit. It doesn't fit. Just a little too wide. Okay, so there's a couple of different ways that I can fix this. I can either just sand this down just a bit so that it'll slide on down into this, or I can take this leg and widen this gap just a bit more. The way that I'm going to fix this is to go ahead and just remove just a little bit more material here. But before that, let me see how this other one fits. I actually need to remove a little bit on this side as well. Let's check this other side. That's just a hair that probably just needs to be sanded. This is just like a, not even a 64th, so. All right, we can work with this. So on this leg, I just need to shave just a hair off of each one of these notches. Okay, so now let's see how it fits. Much better. So now that we know that they fit, let's go ahead and pre-drill counterbore and just throw some temporary screws in here. Again, I'm going to be taking all of this apart to stain it here in a bit, but we'll go ahead and knock that out just to hold everything together. Before I install this second one, I want to make sure that the top is measuring the exact same distance as the bottom. So this is our back panel put together, and the reason why I put the counterbores in is whenever I reassemble this thing, I'm going to glue everything down and cover these screws with dowels. So let's see how it matches up to our front legs. It's like an odd angle to try to put this thing together. And there you are. And this front leg. Again, I'm going to take this apart to install it, but it'll need to be kicked out. And actually, before I install this, let's go ahead and join the 2 parts of our legs. Actually, let's don't. All right, so let's go ahead and get this front. What am I calling these things again? Leg supports. Okay, so now let's go ahead and get this front leg support installed. Okay, so it looks like that we have one side that fits great. And as always, one side that doesn't. So Let's just shave just a little bit off this and drop this in. There we go. Like a glove. You know what movie that came from? Do you know what movie that came from?
I don't know, I've just heard it everywhere. I don't know a certain movie.
I think it's Ace Ventura.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't know then. It's waiting for me. I think so. Is it?
You haven't seen the Ace Venturas?
Not the whole movies.
Oh my God.
When were those coming? When did they
This is what I have to deal with. Alright? Can't even like do movie quotes and stuff like that because he has no clue what I'm talking about. So now that we know that the front rail fits, let's go ahead and get it installed. Drill hammer, hammer drill.
Hammer drill?
Like it's a real thing, like a hammer drill.
Oh. How does that work?
Like this.
Sort of thing?
It's not made for like to use as a hammer, but it's a hammer drill. Hammers while
Oh yeah, I know what you're talking
hammers while it's drilling like
Yeah.
concrete and stuff like that. But it would be fitting. So with the front and back parts assembled, let's go ahead and mate up our legs. So to attach our legs together, I'm going to draw a straight line across our half laps in both directions. I'm basing it all off of this board. Basically, you're just trying to find the center. So I'm about to install my second screw over here, and check this out. Okay, so I was still using the 2-inch screws that I used to actually install the supports, and the material is only 1.5 inches thick. So since this is actually counterbored in about 1/4 inch, let's take this baby out and put in a 1-inch screw. Now this is more like it. And again, for the final assembly, all of this will actually have glue. Okay, much better, and you won't get stabbed protruding screw. See how she looks. The general idea is going to be, we're going to have a board that's going to sit across here. We're going to use that as our pivot point. The bottom on the front has to be lower than the back. That way it can actually swivel in. So that's going to be my biggest concern right now, is that this measurement, will it actually give me enough clearance for that swing? One way to find out. Okay, so now that we have our base pretty much done, the only thing left would be the pivot point board that goes across the top. Let's go ahead and start working on the, what the heck would you even call it? It's like the tabletop shelf contraption. Let's go ahead and start working on the transforming mechanism of this. So that's going to be all of the parts that will make it a tabletop whenever it's laid flat, or a shelf whenever it's vertical. And for that entire mechanism, I'm going to be using 1.5 by 1.5 stock. There's a couple of things that I'm going to do first. Start off by getting the 6-inch arm parts ready to be connected to our 12-inch parts. And to do that, I'm going to be using pocket holes. For all 10 of our 6-inch parts, I'm going to be putting a pocket hole on 2 sides of each piece. And the reason why I'm doing this before we stain, that way we don't have to worry about painting or staining in that 90-degree corner. So let's go ahead and get our arm supports ready. So once we attach the arms to this, we'll actually sit like this, and this is the mechanical part of it. So in order for it to have that mechanical action, we're going to be putting pivot points in this and using 1/4-inch steel bolts that are 3 inches long. So since this version will actually have 5 different shelves, we'll need 5 of these different pivot points cut into each one of our arm supports. So we're going to start off by measuring down each one of our arm supports and making marks at 3/4 inch, 13 3/4 inch, 26 3/4, 39 3/4, and 52 3/4. And then once we have those marked, we'll measure 3/4 inch in. This will mark out our pivot points where we need to pre-drill and counter bore our bolt holes. So now that we have our 5 different pivot points marked, I'm going to start by counter boring with a 3/4 inch Forstner bit. Now you can use this or you can use a spade bit. Either way, you just need to counter bore enough so that the bolt head actually sinks into the wood. And if you're wondering why I'm using such a big counter bore, it's so I can fit a socket around this later. Even though this is a 1/4 inch bolt, the head for this is 7/16. So I'm just making sure to leave plenty of room for the socket. So now that we have counter bored these, if you notice in the very center of each one of these holes, whether you're using a spade bit, Forstner bit, however, your bit will have left an indentation. And we'll use that little indentation because we know that it's in the very center of the board as our guide for our drill bit. And also to ensure that this remains straight, I'm going to be using Craig's drill guide. So since we're using 1/4 inch bolts, I'll be using a 1/4 inch drill bit to drill these holes. Watch your fingers. So this is what we have. Now we just need to repeat this for the other 3. So with your first one done, you just line all 4 of your legs up. Make sure that they are flush on the end. Throw a clamp in the center. Throw a clamp on both ends, and then transfer your center marks from your first board onto the remaining 3. So once we have the remaining arm supports drilled, we'll go ahead and stain, paint, whatever you'd like to do to all of our parts. Then we're ready to assemble. So now it's time to stain this wood, and since I'm using pine, I'm going to make sure to use a pre-stain before I put my actual stain on this. That pre-stain, that's just going to keep it from getting that blotchy look. And for the shelf's base, I chose a stain color called Gunstock. It looked pretty good on a little sample piece. And again, you've heard me say it in other videos, I am not sponsored by makers, but their stain pad and stain sponge are awesome. Forget all of this streaking left from old rags or underwear, whatever you're choosing to use. These things are where it's at. I'll throw a link in the description. So I took apart the entire base, stained it with this Gunstock stain. I don't like it, okay? It is too red for me. It's just too red. So I'm going to do a little stain stacking. Since this has already been stained once, it will not absorb as much. So I'm going to use a dark walnut stain on top of this. It's still going to have like this red hue, but it's going to be more of an ambered look. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to coat it with this dark walnut. And then instead of letting it kind of sit and soak, I'm going to wipe it back off. And there we have it. A nice amber look versus kind of a red look. So I'm gonna do them all like this. So if you ever stain a project and you're not happy with the way that it turned out, try stain stacking. I honestly have no clue if that is a real word. It's just what I've always called it to get the exact look that I want. Much better. All right, so finally everything is stained, dried, and to the colors that I wanted. I decided to go a step darker on the arm supports than I did for the base, and then even darker for the arms themselves. So now that I finally got the color that I was looking for this base, let's go ahead and get this thing glued up and reassembled. Left the cap off, bought a booger. Ooh, almost did it again. 1-inch screws. About screwed it to the table. So with their base put back together, let's go ahead and head over and start assembling these arms. Okay, so I have all of my arm parts here. We have our 12-inch pieces. We have our 6-inch pieces. And I'm going to fasten something to this table just to push against. So if you have a bench dog system, however, just throw in some bench dogs. I do not. So I'm just going to use a straight edge and a couple of clamps, because whenever you're putting in pocket holes, oftentimes you're applying quite a bit of pressure and you don't want these parts to move. So that's what I'm going to do. That'll work. And to assemble these 10 arms, I'll be attaching my 6-inch piece with the pocket hose to the ends of each one of my 12-inch parts. Right, so this is basically what we're going for, this L shape here. Now for the larger unit that I'd made, I actually put an extra support bracket on the inside of this. But if you're planning on putting something super heavy on this, the extra bracket will not hurt a thing. Ew, that one did not go in straight. Redo. Since that hole was already started, I'm going to have to clean it off and switch sides. Need to put some down pressure right here at this joint. Much better. Okay, so now with all of my arms put together, I found something else that I do not like. This stain that I used was actually some type of aging stain. Supposedly you put it on and it gives it this charred look. Well, it actually does. It's all over my hands and pretty much everything else. So I want to kind of distress this up a little bit. That way when I put a finish on this, it won't look as charred, and hopefully some of the colors of the grain will come out. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Right, so now that we have all of our arms assembled, we need to drill the pivot holes in each end of these. And we'll use the same end measurement as we did for the arms. The fine center will measure 3/4 of an inch down, 3/4 of an inch in, and that's where our 1/4 inch pivot point hole will go. And we'll be doing the same for both ends. You can use a tape measure, you can use this method to measure, but these need to be pretty precise, because if they are off a little bit, they will stick up above the arm support, and whenever it's laid flat, they're not all going to be level. So to make sure that I'm drilling my pivot points in the exact same place on every one of these, I made a jig. Everybody knows that I love jigs, so Why not for this? So that's all that I've done is taken some scrap plywood and CA glued it together. That way it would fit perfectly over 1.5 inches material. Once I had that, I just measured 3/4 of an inch up from the end and then just drilled a hole in the very center. Now that's all that I have to do is bring it to the very edge of my arm and use that pre-drilled hole to make a starting point for my drill bit. And for all my creative people out there that like to discuss their ideas, run it by other makers, including myself, make sure to check out our Patreon community. It is a super interactive community where we can share our ideas, run problems by each other, and help to work the problem. If a community atmosphere like that sounds like something that you would like, head on over and give it a look. I'll make sure to throw a link on my website and in the description. So is there an easier way to do this? Probably. There's easier ways to do most things that I do. But I like to show how to do things in, I guess, kind of its simplest form, just in case someone doesn't have a drill press. Keep in mind whenever you're watching me do any of this stuff, if you have the tool that would make that step easier, use it. And if you don't, you can do it like this. Okay, so have a little bit of a problem. Was hearing some rustling around up in the rafters. And I have a visitor. All right, come on. Gonna have to let you out, do a bird call. Cheep, 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 cheep. Cheep. I don't know how to call to this bird. Maybe I just chase it. There you go. See you later, little buddy. Never a dull woman around here. Too bad it wasn't a turkey. So now that I have everything stained up, everything's dry, all my stuff's put away, I forgot to cut the part that actually sits on top of this and supports the weight of the full system. So now I've got to do that, pre-stain it, stain it, all that fun stuff. But anyway, the part that I'm about to cut, I'm going to call this the main brace because it's the main brace. It's what will be holding everything up and transferring the weight of the shelf down onto these legs and into the ground. So since we know that the tops of these are 8 inches across and we know that these leg supports were 42 inches long, we needed an 8-inch board that's 42 inches long. Let me go ahead and get that cut, stained, and all that fun stuff. Okay, so I'm heading back to the wood pile where we started, looking for a board that it's going to have to be a 2x10 since it needs to be 8 inches wide. And 42 inches long. That looks decent and is straight. And of course my bench is in the way. By the way, if you've seen the video for this, the official name that we decided on was A Minute Past Midnight. Make sure to check that out and read the meaning behind it all. And if you have any ideas on what I can do with this thing, let me know. I love my passion projects, but this one is kind of in the way. These things are getting narrower. I think this one will work. This worked. Okay, so while we're waiting for that to dry, let's go ahead and start assembling our arm assemblies. We're going to be using 10 1/4-inch bolts that are 3.5 inches long. I think maybe earlier I said 3 inches long. I really can't remember, but they're 3.5 inches long. 3 inches long will not work even with this inset by the time that we add our washers to it. So it's going to stick out a little bit. If you don't like that, you may be able to go down to maybe like 3 1/4. But anyway, for this one, I'm going to be using 3.5. So we're going to be needing 10 of those, and then we'll need a 1/4-inch lock nut for each of those, as well as washers. We're actually going to be using those to help this material pivot, kind of metal on metal instead of wood on wood. So for each bolt that we use, we're going to need 3 flat washers. So the first thing that I'm going to do is set my material up off my table. It's just a little easier this way because I'm going to be placing the bolts. And you can see I have these divided out into groups of 2. So this is going to be 1 arm assembly. This will be 1 arm assembly. Then each one of those will get 5 arms. So to start out, I'm just going to put a washer on a bolt and feed it through. Now some of these will slide right in, and others may need a little bit of positive persuasion. So once we have those partially installed, you can see that they're still sticking out just a bit. Actually a lot of bit. That's fine. We can remove our little blocks that I was using for the standoff and put these face down. And then I'll finish driving these bolts on in. So now with our bolts flush from the outside, let's go ahead and put another washer on each one of these bolts. And now we are ready to start installing our arms. Okay, so I'm going to start on one end. I'm going to take the 6-inch part of the arm and then attach it to the board that's closest to me. Slide this down. Then I'm going to attach it to the first bolt on our top board. So by doing it this way, as I attach the arms, they will actually space themselves out as I go. So after I have my first one just kind of setting in place, I'm going to go ahead and add the rest of these. And for some reason, if you run into one that's just like super tight, go ahead and just run your 1/4 inch bit back through this. And now you can already see how this mechanism is going to work. Pretty cool. Love it. Now let's go ahead and put one more washer on the outside, and then we'll install our lock nut. I'm just going to get these started, and I'll turn it on its side to actually tighten it down. I'm going to go ahead and snug these up, and if they're too tight, like it won't open and close without a lot of force, then you'll just loosen them up just a bit. All right, let's see if she'll open. There we go. I think that it will probably loosen up, but I'm going to leave it just a little tight for now. Again, I think that they'll loosen up on their own. Ow! Okay, so safety advisory here. These things pinch. So if you are making these things, be careful. Don't get your fingers pinched off. Any of these transforming shelves, they're not to be put anywhere in a kid's room or anywhere near kids, because it's pretty easy to get your fingers pinched with this thing. So, FYI, that's what we want without the pinch. And then we'll just do the exact same thing for our other set. So now I have both of my arm assemblies complete. So there's one thing that could be a possible issue, and I wanted to go ahead and mention that. Whenever you're assembling these, you want to assemble it in this orientation. So go ahead and set it up as if it's going to be on your shelf. We want the overhang of the arm supports on the same ends, and we also want this 12-inch board to line up with that arm support. And then another mistake that could be easily done is if we accidentally put the arms on the opposite side. So once you have your first one done, lay it out just like this. And then whenever you install your arms for the second support, just make sure that they're both on the inside. It wouldn't do us any good if the arms were on the supports on the exact same side on both. So just keep that in mind. Now that these are done and my main brace is dry, let's go ahead and get everything put together. I'm going to set this on the ground just so it's a little easier to work with. And now we have our main support. It's all stained, dried, ready to go. And the way that it's going to sit will be right on top of this. But we're not going to fasten this down just yet. We actually need to get our arm assemblies and slide them on first. All right, so I have one of the arm assemblies here. Like I was saying, we have one side with this overhang like this. I want it to be in the front of this unit. And I have this base set up with the front side facing out. I'm just going to pick up this edge and drop this into place, just temporarily here, like that. And then I'll grab our second one, and good thing I did not fasten this into place because our arms are on the outside. Don't put the arms on the outside. Just move this down. Now the arms are on the inside. We're going to do the same thing with our second one. So the arms are facing in. So just as an example here, this is how it's going to be. The main thing that I was worried about was the clearance here. I did not want it to hit that front bar, and it didn't. Let's go ahead and get our main support attached to this base frame. I'm just going to move these arms in and kind of out of the way for now. Now, if you're wanting to make this a mobile unit, now would be the time that you would put the casters on. And if you're going to use casters, it may be hard to find them that are only 1.5 inches wide. So what I would do if I were going to install casters is just build the bottoms out a bit. That way the whole caster base will actually be able to connect. And also keep in mind, if you're planning on using casters, the legs themselves may need to be a couple of inches shorter. That way that the height of the table is not too high once the casters are put on. So to attach my main support to my base, I'll be using 1/4 inch by 3 inch lag screws, and I'll be installing 2 on each side. So for the lag screw placement, I'm going to measure in from the edge 2 inches, and then 3/4 inch from the edge. I'll do this for all of my sides. So with that measurement, it will ensure that whenever I install this lag, that it actually goes down into the center of the base. I'm going to counterboard just like we did for the arms, pre-drill, pop these babies in. So once we have all that attached, now let's attach our arm assemblies to the main support. I'm just going to move these back out to the outside edges and bring this in. We have 5 arms here. The main beam is ran through the 3rd arm, and then I'm going to move it all the way forward until it meets the corner of this arm. We're going to measure in 1 5/8 from the outside edge to the edge of our top support. So with this at 1 5/8, I just threw a clamp under this arm to help keep everything square. These main arm assemblies will be attached to the main support through the center arm itself, not the outside rail, but the center arm. So depending on what you're planning on storing on this will really determine what type of fastener that you're going to use. Since I'm designing this one to be more for like an indoor or a lighter weight use, I'll just be using 2.5 inch screws. If you're planning on storing something pretty heavy on this, then go ahead and throw in some lag screws. And for this screw placement, I'm just going to measure in 3.5 inches from the back of the arm and 7.5 inches into the center of my arm. And yes, these screws will actually be covered by whatever boards that we're going to install next, but we still need to countersink them because there's going to be a board sitting on top, and we want that board to be able to sit flush. All right, and this is the action that we're looking for here. We go from our flat table to shelf. I just pinched the heck out of my finger again. Warning, watch your fingers whenever you're messing around with this thing without a top on it. Very easy to get your fingers in any of these spots. So again, keep this stuff away from the kiddos. I'm gonna go ahead and get this other arm installed, and then the hard part. We need to figure out what we're gonna be using as a top for this. Now, if it's just gonna be in your garage or something like that, then you could just use plywood or 2x, whatever you would like. But since I'm wanting this to look a little nicer, I'm gonna find something a little different. I'm not gonna get too wild just because we built this out of construction grade material, but I'd still like it to look nice. And there's another thing we need to think about. If we were planning on using this outside, let's say that you wanted to put plants or something like that on this, then maybe we should do a top that has slats or something like that. So lots of different options. Okay, so now with both of these attached, and once we get the shelves in, it's really going to tie everything together and make this thing really stable. It's starting to come together. So back to the lumber. Each one of these shelves are going to be just a little bit under 13 inches wide, but they do not have to be just one solid plank. Now again, if you're using this in your garage, then you may use some plywood or something like that. But if you're wanting to use regular lumber, I would use a 3/4 inch or maybe a solid 1 inch. But again, you can put several boards together to make this 13 inch wide. And then for the length of these shelves, they're going to need to be 35.5 inches long. So I'm going to see what I have in the reserves here without going out and actually buying something. Again, I'm really not wanting to use plywood. If this was going to be a plant stand or something like that for outdoors, you could go back with the pine, maybe a treated top or something. Let's see, I've got some walnut, some maple. I really don't want to put walnut on top of pine. So here's some pine. This is actually reclaimed pine. These are just some cut-offs that I had left over. So let's stick with the pine theme here. And I'm just going to put a reclaimed top on. Utilize what I have. So that's what I'm going to try to do. They're going to need to be planed and edged. So let me get that done and then we'll install these babies. Okay, so by the time that I got all of these edged and cleaned up, we are right at about 6 inches wide. So by using this size material, I'm actually going to be leaving some spacing in between all of my boards. That way the little gap that we're going to have between the shelves won't be noticeable. So as a similar alternative to this, you could just use 1 inch pine from a big box store. I'm going to get these parts cut down to 35.5 inches, then we'll get them installed. So I'm just going to roughly lay these out just to kind of see, you know, if I like the look. And what I'm doing is just lining it up with the edge of each one of these arms so it's flush. And I'm going to leave about a 1/2 inch gap in between, and that will make the spacing for the gaps for the arm mechanisms to actually work, because the gaps in between each one of these arms are exactly 1 inch apart. So if we leave a 1/2 inch gap, and these are 6 inch boards, it's going to push this last board out over that gap a 1/2 inch. Actually liking the way that this is looking. Kind of gives it a cool look. Now that I like. It's coming together. Okay, we're going to stick with this. So I like the gap because whenever it's laid back flat like a table, there are no obvious gaps. There are no obvious anything that this is mechanical, transformable, whatever you want to call it. So I dig this. Clamp on both sides because right now they're both running independently. Once we tie all of these together with these boards, then they will actually move as one. Now you can actually install these screws from the bottom if you would like. If you did not want any screws showing at all, I'm probably just going to countersink and kind of use maybe like a brass looking screw or a bronze. The way that we are going to start out is the very edge of the first board, and again this is the front. I'm going to line everything up flush with this first edge and the side of my arm. I'm going to measure in 1 inch from each side, so at 1 and 5. This is if you're using 6 inch boards like I am, and then 3/4 inch in, put it in the center of that arm. And now I'm going to pre-drill and counterbore. So now if this first board in and I know that I want 1/2 inch spacing, just cut a couple blocks that are a 1/2 inch that I'm going to use as spacers. So my first board on the front here, I'm going to go ahead and put my last board on now. The reason why I'm doing this, just in case these arms are just a little bit out of square, I'll be able to see that once I put my board on and actually pull it into this width. That's going to keep me from gradually working my way out and then my last board doesn't fit. I'm just going to line my first board up at the front of the arm, just like I did for the first one. I'm going to put my 1/2 inch spacers in. just to find out my placement. And it actually was. It was actually, looks like about 1/8 of an inch off. So by this being installed and actually pulling this in, and it could just be something as simple as just a little bit of a bow in one of the arms, this will pull everything back in level with the first one. So now that we have our first board and our last board installed, just going to check it out, see how everything works as one, and it is in harmony. All right, so let's go ahead and get the rest of these installed. And I'll continue to install the rest of these boards the exact same way that I installed the first two. Okay, so let's test this baby out with all of our shelves / tabletop attached. I'll probably make a pin stop maybe at 45 degrees. If you had like plants that needed sun or something like that, this would be a perfect situation for that. Greenhouse, during the day you could bring them out for some sun, or at night storm away. There's just so much that you can do with a shelf like this or a table like this. A couple things left to do and then we're done. I'll eventually end up putting a finish on this. So since this transforming table is a lot lighter than our super heavy duty one that we made before, and our tabletop weight is perfectly centered onto our frame, you actually don't even need legs for this one. You just need something like this. So this is a spring locking pin. Okay, so you would just install it, then you would just pull it out to unlock it. You can use something fancy like this, or you could just drill a hole in here and use a bolt. So up to you. Since I have these, I'm going to go ahead and throw these in. You're going to need one on each side with the table flat. And you want to install this on the outer frame at the exact place that your lower arm support intersects. All right, now with this installed, the table's not going anywhere with the weight pushing on this side of it, which is the pivot side. But if you pull out on your little pin, unlocks, allows it to freely move. Now whenever you come back up, you'll have to pull the pin out in order for it to seat. And it'll seat itself. So you can use something like that if you'd like. If you don't want to, throw a bolt in it. Okay, since we do not have legs on this, now again, you could always put legs on it if you wanted to, but we're going to need some way to lock this vertical. Actually, with it just being in this position and everything being completely centered, it stays exactly like this. But just for safety's sake and pinch fingers, we'll go ahead and install another one of these fancy little spring locks. I'll throw a link to these into the description. They're actually pretty heavy duty, and we'll wrap this up. So what we're going to do to install this one, it's going to be right above our main support into the side of this bottom arm support, and we will center this with the arm. So now it's not going anywhere without this pin coming out. So actually, if you pull these pins out and turn them to the right, they lock. So even better. Now with this pin pulled out, you're free to fold it into a table, turn this to the left, obviously, lock that in. It's locked in as a table, and then to lock it into a shelf, we'll go back to our top pin, push it in once you're vertical, and it's a shelf. All right, guys, so this was a super fun build. We tried some new things this time. We tried working some problems as we came to them, and this is what we came up with. Pretty awesome. I'm super pumped with the way that this thing turned out, but I'm not done with it yet. I'm still wanting to put a finish on this. There's some counterboards that I'm wanting to put some dowels in, and I would like to see what this thing looks like on casters. So by the time you actually see this video, this thing may actually be on casters. We'll see. So thank you guys for joining me on this journey. I hope that you were able to actually problem solve with me and break down some different ideas. And if you decide to build this, you don't have to build it just like this. You just need the basic concept, and then the rest is up to you. Pick your own color schemes, pick your own material, and pick your own uses. With just a bit of creativity, you can come up with something like this. And that's awesome. We'll see ya.